History is written by the victors, but legend is often written by the dramatists. Today we step out of the shadows of Tudor propaganda and modern historical fiction to look at the life of a woman who shaped the crown of England without ever wearing it. But to understand her, we must look to West Wales, to the mighty stone walls of Pembroke Castle. This is where a young, vulnerable girl found sanctuary and where she gave birth to a dynasty. This is the true story of Margaret Beaufort, the ultimate survivor, whose destiny was bound to Pembrokeshire and the real kingmaker. Modern television and historical novels love a simple villain. They paint Margaret Beaufort as the Red Queen, a cold, fanatically religious schemer driven by blind obsession. But fiction flattens what history reveals. The real Margaret was not a caricature. She was the most brilliant, resilient, and successful political operative of the 15th century, a survivor who mastered the art of soft power in a world ruled by steel. Her genius was forged in trauma, finding a vital sanctuary in Pembrokeshire. Born in Bedfordshire in 1443, her life was a checklist of survival. At just 13 years old, widowed, and 7 months pregnant, she fled to the safety of Pembroke Castle under the protection of her brother-in-law, Jasper Tudor. In a cold tower chamber overlooking the river, she went through a labor so severe it nearly killed her and permanently prevented her from bearing more children. On that winter day in January 1557, her only child, Henry Tudor, was born. To protect this young boy, she navigated 4 strategic marriages, outlasting husbands and kings alike. Even when Henry had to flee Pembrokeshire years later to begin a 14-year exile in Brittany, Margaret stayed behind, playing the long game at court. Though she could not rule in her own right, Margaret commanded the authority of a sovereign. This is best seen in her signature, Margaret R. Officially, the R stood for Richmond, her title as Countess, but visually the dramatic flourish was indistinguishable from the R used by queens for Regina. It was a masterclass in visual diplomacy, asserting royal status and projecting supreme authority, all while maintaining perfect legal deniability. In 1483, Richard III seized the throne. Despite being placed under strict house arrest, stripped of her estates, and forbidden from writing to her son, Margaret became the nerve center of a massive conspiracy. She forged a secret alliance with her former rival, the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville, and orchestrated the Buckingham Rebellion. She even brokered the political marriage of her son to Elizabeth of York, uniting the fractured Lancastrian and Yorkist factions under one banner. But Margaret's greatest strategic move was her 4th marriage to Thomas Stanley. Stanley was a political survivor, famous for hedging his bets. At the climactic Battle of Bosworth, while King Richard III and Henry Tudor clashed on the field, Stanley held his massive army on the ridge, refusing to engage. At the critical moment, Margaret's years of influence paid off. Stanley's forces swept down the ridge, smashed Richard's flank, and secured the crown for her son. She won the Wars of the Roses without drawing a single sword. Yet Margaret's ruthless reputation has birthed a dark myth. Modern writers and Ricardian revisionists have long accused her of being the hidden hand behind the murder of the princes in the Tower. But this theory is a late 17th century invention, entirely empty of contemporary proof. Not a single chronicle from the 15th century, nor even the hostile Yorkist propaganda machine, ever pointed a finger at Margaret Beaufort. The accusation simply ignores physical reality. The princes were locked inside the royal apartments of the Tower of London, a fortress locked down under the direct command of Richard III. The guards were not random mercenaries. They were Richard's hand-picked, fiercely loyal northern retainers. Margaret was completely outside Richard's inner circle and she possessed absolutely no physical or political pathway through those impenetrable stone walls. A true mastermind requires motive, opportunity, and means. Margaret certainly had the motive, as clearing the York heirs benefited her son's path to the throne, but she had zero opportunity, and the idea that she had the means to bribe the gods is a fantasy. No hand-picked royal guard would risk execution, treason, and the utter ruin of their families on a bribe from a disgraced woman on the losing side of a civil war. The most telling piece of evidence is the silence of Richard III himself. If Margaret or Henry's faction had smuggled assassins into the Tower, Richard would have discovered it. He was fighting a desperate propaganda war to destroy Henry's credibility. Had he possessed even a shred of suspicion, he would have shouted it to the world. Instead, Richard remained entirely silent. He never blamed them, because he knew they couldn't possibly have done it. What about her reputation as the mother-in-law from hell? This myth stems from a single Spanish ambassador, Pedro de Ayala, who wrote that Queen Elizabeth was kept in subjection by Margaret. But de Ayala was a male diplomat projecting traditional folklore stereotypes onto a powerful woman. The actual historical record shows a deep partnership. Elizabeth and Margaret jointly commissioned religious works, shared a household, and worked together to protect the young Princess Margaret from the trauma of early childbirth. Fiction also claims Margaret wrote the oppressive Articles for the Regulation of the Household to obsessively control the Queen's life. But modern historical research has debunked this. Historian K. Staniland proved these articles were simply copies of older Yorkist court ordinances from the reign of Edward IV. They even contained rules for a Queen Dowager, a title Margaret never held. She didn't write them, she simply inherited them. What Margaret actually did was expand the boundaries of medieval womanhood. In 1485, her son took the unprecedented step of declaring her a femme sole, a single woman in the eyes of the law, even though she remained married to Stanley. This gave her absolute control of her vast wealth and estates. She wasn't just a figurehead, she actively administered justice, operating as the king's unofficial, highly trusted lieutenant in the Midlands. With her immense power, she became one of England's greatest patrons. Known as Domina Fundatrix, she refounded Christ's College and established St. John's College at Cambridge. She patronized William Caxton, bringing the printing press to the mainstream, and translated complex theological texts herself. In 1497, she established the Lady Margaret Professorships of Divinity, the very first formal academic chairs in English history. Margaret Beaufort began her life as a 13-year-old pawn in a bloody, unforgiving civil war. Through sheer resilience and unmatched political mastery, she outlived 5 kings, outmaneuvered every man who tried to control her, and built a dynasty that changed the world forever. And it all started in Pembrokeshire, inside the cold tower rooms of Pembroke Castle. Today, her family badge, the portcullis, survives as the official symbol of the British Parliament, a permanent iron stamp on the nation she built from the shadows.